I think we're ready to start. Welcome, everyone. A couple of admin comments first. This is our second to the last symposium. Our last one, as far as speakers, is next week. Next week, we have Mr. Matt Grokoff who's going to come talk about basically a vision for the future of the built infrastructure, how we get to zero energy infrastructure, zero energy homes, zero energy buildings. I think you'll be fascinated by that one. So that's next week, which will be our last speaking session. And then the following week is the last week of classes. So for the students in the classroom, that session you are required to attend. That's when we'll do our class surveys. You'll tell me what a wonderful job we all did, and it'll be a very short class. But that's the last day of classes, that Thursday, 2 weeks from now. We've got a special treat today. We've got Mr. Rob Gardner here from ExxonMobil. I'm sure you're like me, that in the spring you don't sit around waiting for the Academy Awards. You sit around in the spring waiting for this report to come out with bated breath. I throw a little party every year when this report comes out because I'm just so anxious. This and BPs. I read BPs as well, I got to say. But these reports, when they come out, this is it. This is kind of that culmination of data you're always waiting for to see how things are changing and how things are moving in the world. And Rob, he leads the division at ExxonMobil that is responsible for putting this report together every year. And it is a fabulous report, and the fact that they do it and put the time and effort and money into doing it and then make it available publicly as well as the data set behind it is fantastic for researchers like myself, and it really helps my lectures. Rob has been in the industry for over 35 years. He is an oil and gas guy, and in particular a gas guy. He's managed both gas and gas liquids in the U.S. He's worked in the Asia Pacific in the liquid natural gas business. He's managed business development in Qatar, Indonesia, working with national oil companies there. So he's kind of global. Earlier in his career, he worked in engineering activities in supplying gas to U.S. markets. So basically, you were LNG before LNG was cool, right? Back in the days when we thought we were going to import this stuff.
Exactly.
But as I said today, he managed the group responsible for preparing ExxonMobil's energy outlook, and he's also head of their corporate strategic planning department. So he's the one maybe who doesn't necessarily make the decisions, but he advises the decision makers on what decisions they should make. He graduated from Louisiana State University, fantastic school, and his first job was down there in Louisiana working for Mobil Oil. So back in the early days. You've been with him for a long time.
I have. Actually, this will be 39 years in June.
Oh my goodness. Well, congratulations. I'm not going to take up any more of his time. He's got about a 45-minute presentation, and then we'll have at least 15 minutes for questions after that. And I'm sure he'd be glad to take questions as they arise during the presentation if you have clarifications or want to engage in more of a conversation. So with that, Rob, thank you.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. It's always great to talk to an audience that's informed on energy. There are many times we talk to people who don't understand a lot of the basics, and I understand that this fits into the curriculum, but is also interesting to a lot of people on campus who are involved in studying energy issues and aware of energy issues. And so ExxonMobil is very happy to have an opportunity to talk to you. And as Fred said, we publish this report to make sure that people out there have a chance to understand what we think. There are a lot of different views on energy and what's going to happen and how it's going to evolve. And we know that the energy system that we live in is an evolution. It's been an evolution from the beginning, and I'm talking back in the 1800s, and it will continue to be. And different sources of energy are going to be used, and different demand and uses for energy occur. I'll talk on a little bit about that as we go on. Just a little bit of background on how we do it. So we do individual country outlooks and we break the world into 100 geographic divisions. We do large countries, a few group them together. And we do that, so we essentially do an energy outlook per country and add them up. Why do we do it at such a detailed level? Well, our goal is not necessarily to study the top level, but it's also to provide our businesses with the information they need to run the businesses in a country. And so that really defines why we work at such a detailed level. The other thing is, why do we think it's important to talk out 25 years or 30 years or whatever the time period we're talking about? Well, in the energy industry in particular, it's an extremely capital-intensive industry. And many times we'll spend and invest dollars for 5 to 7 years before we complete a project or a development of a field or a well or a refinery expansion or any of those activities. And then we expect it to produce income for 20, 30, 40 years. So an outlook that goes out this far in time is intended to cover both that front-end spending period, so we know what that business environment looks like, and also to consider the environment under which it's going to be producing revenue and income for the corporation. And so that long-term view helps us inform our thinking around some of the dynamics are going to in there. The evolution of policy is a great one of those. What's going to happen with policy as it relates to greenhouse gases? We have had a policy overlay in our outlook since 2007, about a decade. We've included greenhouse gas proxy cost as a way, and those increase over time, as a way to affect the fuel mix and change what energy sources are being used. And that's what leads us to these outcomes. Change is happening. Change happens slowly because of the amount of capital required. So I'm going to step back and just talk about a few basics. Let's talk about the world. The world is now on the order of 7 billion people. We're going to add about 1.8 billion people. It's about a 25% increase in population, almost exclusively in developing economies. And that is part of the need to add more energy to the world because these people want the same things we have, and they want access to energy. At the same time, the world GDP is going to about double, and that's going to produce significant increase in income and GDP per capita, the measure of income, raising standards of living and having an impact on people. At the same time, energy is only going to grow about 25%. If you step back and think about it, though, we're going to double the economic output in the world, and we're going to only use 25% more energy. Sounds pretty good, a lot of efficiency. That 25% is equivalent to that little graphic we've got there, which is essentially the Americas. That we're adding that much incremental energy to the system. It's a huge investment in trillions of dollars by companies like ExxonMobil, by institutions, by utility companies, and for consumption, other oil companies, national oil companies, governments. A huge amount of money has got to be spent to produce that incremental energy and fit that into the world energy demand mix. That's going to include wind turbines and solar panels, natural gas facilities and power plants and coal mines and a number of outputs. At the same time, global CO2 emissions are not growing 25%. They grow about 10% and then start to decline. And that's the net total growth over the time period. The energy intensity of the global economy drops almost in half. So we're adding a huge amount of population, we're raising their standard of living, and at the same time, we are producing more CO2 globally, not in the OECD, but that growth is slowing and starting to change. And so there's a lot of good news in the world of energy going forward. So our outlook recognizes broadly a number of themes. The first two are related to sort of the same point I was getting at about standard of living and growth in developing economies. The world's, all the energy growth is going to be in the developing economies. I'll show you a chart in a minute, I'll give you the numbers and all that, but just that's where all the growth is. And that means that's going to electrify India. Today, India has got 300 million people that don't have access to electricity. Africa has a larger number of the population. China now is fully electrified, but if you went back a decade, it wasn't. And so all of those things are happening. Why is electricity important? What does it mean to people? Well, first of all, if you have electricity, you can do things like this, have a meeting in a closed room. More importantly, at night you can study. You can refrigerate food, which means you don't have to collect all your food in one day. You can actually buy it or grow it and put it in a refrigeration device, keep it fresh for several days, and not have to take the time out of every day to provide food for your family. So those are the kinds of things that start to change people's lives. That's real, and that's happening in the world today where people don't have access to it. The other two things, the next thing is energy and economics and policies both affect the energy we use. And I'll show you more about that. Policies like greenhouse gas policies, but also what's the best choice for electricity generation depending upon your needs, or for automobiles. Oil and gas continue to be significant energy sources in the world. We rely heavily on oil for transportation and for chemical feedstocks. Natural gas is an important growth fuel as it starts to play a bigger role in power generation, but it's usable across all of our demand sectors. Whether it's in transportation, we use it in residential heating and cooling, cooking, and we use it in commercial applications. Natural gas plays an important role in industry as well. And not last, or certainly not least, is technology and how technology changes and provides growing support for evolution of the energy mix, new types of energy, more efficient ways to use energy. Those are all very important. Just coming back to the relationship between people, standard of living, and energy use. So this is a chart that plots, this scatter plot shows on the left the Human Development Index from the UN compared to energy use per capita across the bottom. And you can see a general direction in relationship to it, and from the lower, less developed economies to the higher developed economies. The Human Development Index is based on three primary components. One is is standard of living and GDP per capita, income levels. Another one is level of education and how far education the cultures have advanced. And the last point is life expectancy. And that's related very closely to healthcare and access to healthcare. So three important measures that fit into a society's development. And when you see, as you move up the page, you get into a higher level of development. But there's a broad correlation that it requires more energy to move into society's development. That picture I had up at the beginning, that was Shanghai. And if you consider what the level of energy consumption in China 30 years ago, it would have been significantly lower. Now, they were educating people, building infrastructure. They were trying to significantly move forward their standard of living, and they did successfully. And that moved them up the page. But that did require more energy for the individual Chinese person. And they do have access to electricity. They do have access to transportation. They have very modern transportation systems along the provincial coast in the major cities, which are now expanding into other parts of China. So there's a huge amount of development that requires energy. So if we look at income, GDP per capita, and we take the world's currently the way it lays out, and we color code it, and if you're far on the left of this bar, and it's 2015 and you're dark red, you have about $1,000 US dollar equivalents per capita per year. As you move to the right and you get into the blue, you start to move above and deep into the OECD nations, which have very high GDPs per capita or income levels. And you can see it concentrated in Australia, Japan, Korea, the US, Canada, Western Europe, and the Middle East economies have very high GDP per capita. 2040, if you go out there, you see the world turns bluer. That's that income effect rising. Matter of fact, by 2040, we expect GDP per capita in China to start to be where the European GDP per capita is now on a purchasing power parity basis. That's pretty significant. And so with that evolution, you'll see rising standards of living. Personal mobility is an important thing for people. And I'll show you an interesting chart, which you may find, when we look at it that way, it adds a little different twist to it. Anyway, this is all important. What it relates to, though, is the middle class. In 2015, middle class is a little over 2 billion people. It's going to reach just under 5 billion people by 2040. And you'll notice that it's not growth in the OECD. We already have a very highly penetrated middle class. But we do see significant growth in many of other economies around the world rising into middle class. What does middle class mean? Our definition thinks of it this way. It thinks of it as based on people that have disposable income that can make a choice of what they're going to do with that. So I have an extra $1. What am I going to do with it? Well, or a yuan, or a rupee, or you pick the currency. I can decide that I want a bigger house, that I have a larger family, I want a bigger house. I can decide I want to send my children to higher education. I can pay for that. I need health care, different health care services. I can buy those. I can buy entertainment. I can go on trips. That's what the disposable income means. And that's what that means to be in the middle class. And when you see that unprecedented rise across the world in the middle class, there are a lot of people making choices about what to do. And those relate to, generally, things that require additional energy. This is the world economic growth output. We do our own economic output. We break it between the OECD and the non-OECD. The little percentages, the numbers on the top are annual average growth rates. The OECD is running around 2%. Population decline, working age population decline is slowing the population effect. Productivity is modest these days. Investment, the growth, developing economies. Matter of fact, you'll notice that China and India combined will produce more economic output than the U.S. and Europe combined in the outlook window. That's a pretty significant statement. The world GDP is doubling. It's going up to about $150 trillion on our analysis, and more than half of that increase, or more than a third of the total increase, is coming from China and India, and that represents a significant amount of change of income within those economies. So where's the energy coming from? Well, demand grows 25%, and there's a lot of efficiency, which I already pointed out in the beginning. But if you look at the breakdown of energy growth, the developing economies our energy demand is down about 4 or 5%, while the developing economies are up 45%. Now, if you've talked about energy, you've talked about countries needing energy, you've considered economic development, and you think back over the last decade, you would assume that a lot of the energy demand growth has come from one place, China. And that would generally be correct. They have been one of the largest impacts on this. But as you look forward from today to 2040, India and China are almost the same in increase in energy. They're at different places in the development cycle. That difference in development means that India is moving more and more into heavy industry necessary for infrastructure development. I'm talking steel, cement, iron ore processing, all of that. Today, China is in the high 50s, almost 60% urbanized, on its way to 70%. They have a goal to add 100 million people into urban centers in the next 5 years. They're probably only going to add one more 100 million after that in the next 15 years. They're well advanced. So they've built a lot of those cities. Matter of fact, there's a perception they have a lot of apartments that aren't filled up yet. They are going to move 100 million people into cities, so I have a feeling they're going to use them. But that's the kind of thing that drives energy demand in society. Well, India is building roads, they're building power plants, they're building cities, they're expanding cities, they're building high-rises, and that's what's driving more and more of that energy into India. And what that means is over time, their GDP is going to grow faster. So I've got a couple charts in here on the U.S., and I just want to bring it back from the world to the U.S. This chart shows the U.S. population grows about 15%. Our GDP, though, does go up about 75%. Significant increase. Not quite as much as the world equivalency, but we do grow a little bit slower than on average for global economy. Energy demand, you could call it down, call it flat. It's pretty close. It's not going up, despite a significant increase in output of our economy. Much more efficiency. Part of that is transition in energy. Part of that is more efficient use, more efficient cars. Carbon emissions will trend down about 20%. We'll have significant drop in carbon intensity in the U.S. Now, this is part policy-driven, but also part driven by basic economics. Natural gas is being more heavily used on an economic basis in U.S. power plants, and that's already produced significant fall in U.S. energy-related CO2 emissions. Just a little bit about the policy and economic story. But there's a lot of work that's been done by the International Energy Agency to assess what's going to happen in the future, possible outcomes for the energy mix. And the IEA current policies case, and they're based in Paris, they support the OECD, they work with a lot of non-OECD economies, and they assess it's a significant increase in energy demand across the board if nothing changes, if we just live with current policies. They have a 450 case, which is their case that they say would reach about a 2-degree increase and would avoid unnecessary warming. That case actually requires significant policy changes well beyond policies that are in place today and potential economic impact. Their new policies case is one that involves a policy evolution, very similar to ours, by the way. If you put the two up there, which is what the 17 EO is, our energy demand and new policies case is about the same. It's not business as usual. It is a growing level of greenhouse gas policy impacts, growing efficiency in transportation, a rising use in renewables and non-carbon power, and all of those add to the overall outcome. And this is, the view is if you have policy shift, you can start to move to the right side of the page. It's very, very difficult to get to 450. The level of policy transition would have to happen at a much advanced pace, and none of the current proposals out there get to that. Many of them fall into ranges such as where the IEA new policies are or our ExxonMobil's energy outlook has been. What does happen in the energy mix space, so this is 100%. So this is the shares of energy, and this is where it is today and where it's going. And what you see is an increase in renewables, wind and solar, and nuclear. And most of that nuclear is not in the developed economies. You see a reduction in coal, some growth in gas, lower carbon footprint used in power generation is a great success story, and a reduction in oil share as well. And so all of that is this transition I'm talking about. I have an end chart that shows it over time. It's real fascinating. This is the overall global emissions profile. You see the OECD is trending down. The U.S., in line with the OECD, sees a fairly substantial reduction. China's emissions grow modestly and then peak and decline. This is because of their transition within their economy, their movement away from more energy-intensive industries, the ability they've built their society, they can stop building steel. The rest of the growth is in the remaining non-OECD economies. That's really what's driving up the overall global emissions. Just a short comparison about two different economies, developed economies, and what's happened with their emissions on electricity basis and how their fuel mix changed within their power generation system. In the U.S., in 2005, half of our generation was coal-based. That's fallen significantly until in 2015, the last full year of data we had when we produced this. Gas has done a tremendous growth. We had some improvement in nuclear, but generally it's renewables. Wind and solar and natural gas have played an increasing role in our energy mix. By definition, those are a lower carbon intensive mix. I'll show you the effect in a minute. Germany has decided that they're going to shut down a number of nuclear power plants. They're going to build extensively wind and solar. They've actually reduced natural gas consumption in their power system. It was not competitive. They've kept a lot of coal. Matter of fact, they're starting coal plants up. If you look at the CO2 intensity of generation in Germany and the U.S. is down 20%, while Germany is down about 10%. And you can see that on a CO2 per kilowatt hour basis, the U.S. has actually fallen below Germany. And our electricity costs continue to be extremely competitive while theirs have risen significantly. So the policy choices that policymakers make have a direct impact on what the outcome is and on what the costs are for society. And I think that's an important thing that policymakers and future policymakers need to consider as they go down this. It's not always, oh, well, I just want that. You don't always get what you want because it's an integrated whole. Your whole system has to work together. One of the challenges in doing the outlook is actually coming back and looking at an entire country's energy mix and say, okay, we did all these things. Does it make sense? Do they have the supplies? Can they get the supplies? How much will it cost? So when you start looking at the energy piece, you can't really just go take one out and change it. You have to look at society and say, how is that going to evolve within a country? An example is the U.S. is hugely abundant in natural gas and as well in oil resources. Not every country has those same resources. And so if all of a sudden we say, well, we need to put a lot of natural gas in here, then we go talk with our gas supply experts and say, well, do they have domestic supplies? Well, they have some, Probably not that much. So they're going to import them. Well, does that make sense? Well, some of it maybe. So then you have to iterate back around and come up with a mix that makes sense. And so that's some sort of the nuts and bolts of what we do. So we think oil will remain the largest energy source, but the reality is oil demand is driven largely by transportation historically. But future growth, that's only about half of it. All the other half of the oil demand growth is chemicals. And chemical feedstocks and some fuel come out of, are playing a big role in this. And so you can see by effect with drawing this dashed line is actually vehicle transportation demand for oil goes down. And it goes down across the OECD, and actually at the back end we see some reduction in China. But chemical demand growth is growing globally. Chemicals continue to grow generally at or faster than GDP. Chemical use is very pervasive in society, and it's growing. It can be recycled. That lowers the energy processing cost, but still total demand grows. And that plays an important role. So when we say oil demand is up and stays the largest, we're saying also chemical requirements are part of that story. Transportation. This is one that most of us can connect with because we either drive a car, we ride in a car, we ride in a transit vehicle. Somehow we move around. We may ride a bicycle. Personal mobility is defined by a wide range of things. Light-duty vehicle demand peaks and declines. And it's all the growth in what we call commercial transportation. This is related to economic output. Hauling people, things, producing services, moving those same things, and trade. All of that is part of commercial transportation. So I mentioned personal mobility. So this chart shows, and the way we model this is we take the number of people times the number of cars they're going to have and how that changes, and we estimate how efficient the car is going to be, and then we talk about how far they're going to drive, and then we do all the math and do the algebra and come up with an answer, and that gives us a demand. But we have to start with how many cars. And we do that by modeling it versus GDP per capita, and we come up with these penetrations of hundreds of cars per 1,000 people. Europe, very developed economy, has a very high penetration. India, not so developed, not so high a GDP, not so high a penetration. You sit to yourself, you think, well, there's over 1 billion people. If that's 100, well, it's 10 now, maybe 100, so that's like 1%. We're going to 10. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't. We're not thinking about personal mobility as it's defined in a lot of places. Personal mobility and why is it important? If I wake up today and the only way, and I don't have personal mobility, I'm limited in my choices of employment. I have to work somewhere very proximate to where I am. But when I have access to personal mobility, I can go to a job that's farther away, that pays me more, and allows me to raise my income and change my life and have a different impact on my standard of living. So when you look at the personal mobility dynamics and you start to now take a step back and look at what's happening, and these are two-wheelers and three-wheelers, and then you start to see, well, personal mobility looks like 400 seems to be, a 40% penetration seems to be a level that is consistent with what people can afford. And it's part of that dynamic of trying to understand. Motorcycles, by and large, about 8% of global transportation fuel demand. 30% transportation fuel demand in Indonesia and India. And so how people achieve personal mobility is a really important part in that step up, is that process of changing their standard of living. And so this is an example of how that works. Now, then when you get in these spaces, people have different choices of what they want. In the U.S., if you look, this is a chart that breaks down size of vehicles. And if you look at what's going on in the 30-year period from 1980 to 2010, well, SUVs, vans came in, then SUVs came in. Pickup trucks have been around for a long time. But today, and if you took a data point in 2016, it was about 52% pickup trucks and SUVs made up new car sales. Pretty significant change. Now, those are certainly, they can be efficient, but they're not necessarily as efficient as lighter weighted vehicles. And over time, what happened was the engines were getting more and more efficient in U.S. cars, but the weight of the vehicle got larger, the engine got bigger, and so what happened was we didn't actually see it in real performance. And so what we've had to do now looking forward is trying to take the data on the left and cast it in form of what kind of vehicles are going to be on the road. And so we actually do think that SUVs and pickup trucks will shrink. And what we actually do is we break this down, and we think that there'll be more crossovers, small SUVs sold, and that'll be a growing share in this overall mix. The small car, and I'll come back to this with the electric vehicle conversation in a minute, we think is where you'll see a significant penetration in electric vehicles over time. Small, short-range electric vehicles, we believe, will be more economic over time. The longer-range vehicles will continue to require more batteries, and that'll challenge the base economics. And so you'll see that penetration. Exactly how they fit into the daily mobility puzzle is still part of it. It's part of the commuting aspect. Not every society can adopt it quickly. You need the electrical infrastructure to do it. You need the charging infrastructure. You need the parking infrastructure. You go to China, that doesn't really exist. We were talking about how many cars people are going to drive in China. There's a lot of resistance to offering licenses, particularly in the large metropolitan area, to give people access to vehicles. And it is going to constrain China's overall penetration in vehicles. Still a lot of people with a lot of cars. But the way Dong Fu is our economist, and he describes the streets around where his mother lives, where they park cars, and they just park them. They might park 3 or 4 in parallel, and some are actually just sitting in the street parked. It's going to be pretty hard to plug those in and charge them up. So there's going to be, until the infrastructure catches up, it's going to be hard to achieve some of the level of penetration people think could be out there.
Ron, what are you forecasting about battery technology?
I got a chart on that in just a second. So as you basically, to achieve the efficiency levels we have in the outlook, you've got to walk up a level of technology in the base vehicle. Easiest thing you can do is if you can make them lighter and smaller, you're going to save energy. That's easy. Easy, but you got to get the consumer to buy it. That's not always easy. The next thing you do is you go to advanced powertrains, turbocharging, high compression ratio, advanced combustion. There's a lot of interesting steps in there that you can do that are really, I'll call mild hybridization before you go to the full hybrid. The full hybrid has all of the regenerative braking, the larger battery components. You can pull some of that into the base internal combustion engine before you go to a full hybrid for less cost. But as you move up this page, it costs the manufacturer more. By definition, it costs the consumer more. And so then ultimately you end up with electrification, plug-in hybrids, battery electric vehicles. Generally, we think the plug-in hybrid is a bit of a challenge because you're running complete dual drive chains, and that will tend to challenge the economics, whereas one that's either an internal combustion basis or one that's a battery electric vehicle could probably be more competitively produced. So if you look at over time, battery costs have fallen significantly. The gray shaded area is a bunch of historical data we've seen, and it's been published, and some of it may be a little questionable. We've seen it come down, and so when we look at battery costs, we see them coming down sort of to the level people are touting now as possible, but probably we don't think they will achieve them on the same schedule that they're talking about. But they will come down, and what they do, and if you use the Chevy Bolt battery cost example, which is, we're not entirely sure you're getting full cost recovery of the investment in the battery plant in that one. And so there's some challenges in those economics. But if you just took a short-range vehicle, the 100-mile range vehicle, which has a smaller battery pack, and use that battery cost in there, your incremental costs are a few $1,000s more, but start to make it approach to be economic as those battery costs do come down to those levels. So we do believe that because of that, you will change, it will change the outlook for electric cars in a lot of outlooks. We've raised it in ours. Out towards the last decade, we've increased the battery electric vehicle penetration because of it. We get to total about 110 million overall battery-related vehicles. The reality right now is when you look at what's being sold in the marketplace, is you see the internal combustion engine continue to dominate. The hybrid, we think, and one of the things we did this last year is we actually recalibrated full hybrid versus partial hybridization, and so we saw that advancing in the internal combustion space. And we came back and looked at what's really selling. Interestingly enough, and this has been a steady trend for a number of years now, those boosted vehicles, which are the turbocharged or other type of mechanical improvements in internal combustion engine are where we're seeing the real growth in technology. It's the lowest cost, and consumers can afford it. People have all the other options available down there at the bottom. Diesels are about 20% more efficient. They cost more money. Hybrids can be up to 35% more efficient. They cost more money. Electrics, PHEVs, they provide a more efficient platform. We just talked about that. But right now, the consumption and where the manufacturers are putting more and more money is in the first technology stages. They are exploring all of them, and they're working on them all because in some markets they have to offer them to be able to sell cars in those markets. And so the manufacturers are really the ones that pick the technology and put it in the car. Consumer has to decide how much they're going to buy and how much they're going to pay for it. And so there's a bit of a price discovery and commercial competitive discovery as we go through that. So battery costs are going to drop. The final level is, the technology right now is in some of the base vehicles out there, it's already, a lot of that manufacturing improvement has already been achieved. It's the newer battery types that are going through that manufacturing improvement. And I don't remember the exact labels around those. And there'll be some improvements in the cathode technology and other aspects of that will improve the batteries. But still, you're dealing with the how much you can put in the battery and how fast can you put it into it. And both of those are necessary to establish a really long-term viable platform for a battery electric vehicle. What it does do, though, this whole combination of change, is it just about doubles efficiency in our light-duty fleet. That's why our car fleet grows from about 900 billion cars to 1.8, and we just about double efficiency around the world. The U.S. Gets much closer to the global average and has a significant improvement. Europe gets up there. Japan's up on the top. Significant improvements around the world in efficiency. Certainly kick-started by policy and continues to be driven by policy. This is the U.S. total transportation demand. It is trending down. It is one of the reasons we think U.S. oil demand will gradually, over time, decline. It's driven largely by our light-duty fleet and gasoline in there. There is also some ethanol that adds in. And we do see a fleet transition. And I said it really starts to happen in that last decade. Up till then, all of this efficiency that's making this happen in this time period is the base vehicle getting more efficient. We continue to sell cars in the U.S. Our penetration doesn't rise. But as we have more population that do drive, that does increase the number of vehicles. We don't think the vehicles drive farther in an annual year than they have in the past, even though incomes rise. Generally, what studies show is people will take a different mode of transport, and so that's why airplanes are full. Or other chemicals are growing. I mentioned that earlier. Chemicals grow globally, concentrated in the developing economies in Asia Pacific and the Middle East. Though North America, because of our resource base, is continuing to see growth. Number of projects have been announced. We recently announced a new project in Texas, and we already have one underway now. So these chemical projects will continue to expand and use our resources and provide export products into the marketplace. Liquid supplies and from various regions and types of supply grow across the board. OPEC continues to be an important supply source. North America's role grows and plays a bigger role. Things like tight oil, if you're familiar with the Permian and the Bakken and the development of those oil resources, that's coming in here. That's changed a lot of the U.S. story significantly. Where I started my career was in the red, natural gas liquids. And that's a product, that's a co-product produced with natural gas. You extract it from natural gas before you put it in a pipeline. It's a feedstock to chemicals, and also portions of it are used in bottled gas and LPG. And that plays an important role in standard of living transition because it's the early entry transition fuel in developing economies when they stop using residential applications. They stop using biomass, dung and other things, and they start using LPG bottled gas. More efficient and also doesn't produce the indoor air pollution. A lot of fuel transition going on here. In North America, we see our demand peaking and declining. That's the little black bar, and our supply growing. And while today in the U.S. we export oil as part of a policy revision of a couple years ago, long-term North America is going to be exporting energy around the world. We're doing it now to balance the right needs. We'll do it later because we need to balance versus demand. One point to be made, and there's a lot of discussion about energy investments and what to do with it. The IEA, this is the International Energy Agency's work, says that if we don't invest, if we just stop, 85% of our supply would decline. We need substantially more than that just to keep going constant. That's what the dark blue is. The light blue is what would be necessary to meet that policy case that I showed you earlier, the central case for the IEA. We think the majority of that, about half of it's conventional supplies, and tight oil plays an important role in that. So this is the world's balance. This is a trading balance. So countries that have green export, countries that have red import. Asia Pacific is a significant importer of global liquid supplies. There are 4 billion people, largest, fastest share of the overall global economic growth, rising personal mobility, needs for chemical projects, feedstocks, all of that. And so that's really what we see going forward out to 2040. The bars are 10, 20, 30, and 40.
Can I make a quick observation? So you're basically saying by 2020, North America is essentially energy independent.
I think I would say North America's energy balanced. I wouldn't say energy independence assumes that we don't need anything that comes in. And that's a different statement. Energy independence is a concept, I think, that implies that we don't need the rest of the world to supply anything. Our actual refining institutions along the Gulf Coast are heavily designed to use heavier crude. Matter of fact, we take advantage of that and are able to make a more competitive product that way. A lot of the light ends would actually crowd out capacity in our system and be less efficient and could have a negative impact on jobs. So right now, what it means is we're able to export products after the middle of our outlook. And we may turn some of that, instead of crude, into other products by investments. And so it's an export industry that provides high-value income, jobs, and other components. So the same is true of natural gas. In North America today, the U.S. is exporting natural gas, and that's going to be a growing role. We don't need to import, except maybe to balance winter-summer demand in some markets. So, and that's not a big part, but it's not an insignificant part. Historically, the Northeast has high winter day demands, and they've used import facilities to help balance those. And so it's that international trade that's important in trying to keep everything balanced and working smoothly. It does mean that we won't need to import on a net basis. But U.S. will probably be importing from Canada and exporting to Mexico.
That's why I mentioned North America.
Yeah. So, I mean, it depends on what your lens is, how big your lens is. Natural gas grows more than any other energy source. That's because of its competitiveness, the wide availability, the extensive use. You could, in power generation, up to 60% lower CO2 emission footprint than coal. It's a dispatchable power source. It's usable in transportation fuels. And so I can go on and on. I am a gas guy, so what can I say? So if you look at it, we use, and I know we're supposed to be wrapping up here, so. More than half of the growth in gas demand is going to come from power generation. So I'm just going to talk about that briefly. Electricity demand is up everywhere. We need more electricity. Well, let's put it that way. We find ways to use electricity in even the most developed economies. Populations grow, you need more, you're being more efficient, but you use more. In the U.S. and Europe, we're using less coal, ultimately more gas, and a lot more renewables. In China and India, different. China is using a number of other sources to limit their coal growth. India allows coal to continue to grow and uses other sources. The rest of the world, it depends. Depends on what resources they have. If you have gas resources, you use it. If not, you'll have coal. Asia Pacific will use more coal over time. Indonesia is a coal exporter. They'll start using more coal. Other countries, Thailand. So you'll see, but the major energy components in this are in transition. We add a significant amount of installed global capacity for wind, solar, and nuclear. I'll point out to you that the majority of the nuclear growth is here in China, as is an installed capacity for everything. You'll see that in the U.S., between 2015 and 2040, we add more renewables than Europe does. So you see a very significant growth overall. We get up into the high teen percentages across the developed economies, and globally up well above 10%. The only thing is, this is the U.S. in transition. I just want to make the point that we think power-generated CO2 emissions will probably fall about 40% in the U.S. over the outlook because of a transition away from coal, an increase in gas, growth in renewables, wind and solar. So that's going to play an important transition role. This is the same sort of chart that I just showed you on the oil. Shows a little bit where gas is coming in. North America, if it's light, it's unconventional. Europe doesn't have any more. Their gas supply in red is declining, so they're importing pipeline and LNG. Asia, the majority of their increase is LNG. And that's why when you hear the discussion about North American LNG exports, a lot of discussion about it's going to Asia. Now, it may end up going to Europe and displacing other supplies that go to Asia. That's an economic transition around trade. So LNG grows because of its flexible nature. LNG will just about triple in its component of overall trade. Pipeline, LNG, gas is hard to trade. It's expensive to trade. You got to build ships and plants and pipelines and all that. Oil trade's not as expensive on a per component basis. So about half of global oil is traded. Only about 15% of global gas is traded today, and that grows to about 25%. But when you hear people talking about growing their position in LNG, it's because people see that as a growth area. This is the same chart on the color basis of who's exporting and who's importing. You'll notice that in this case, North America's already in the export mode. We actually export natural gas to Mexico, but we do bring it in, the U.S. does, from Canada. And so this is a growing trend of increased exports. You'll notice that it sort of transitions depending upon the economy. East Africa is a significant source of new identified resources, so we expect that to grow. We expect some growth in the Middle East, Russia, Caspian. The Asia Pacific and Europe will be your primary importers. Interesting, that's also true for liquids. It happens to be where the resources are and where the people are, or maybe where the resources aren't, I should say. I just want to stop and talk about technology for a minute. You know, when you do an outlook like this, and we started the 2040 thing 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, in around 2010 or 11. And, you know, it's real easy to talk about what's going to happen, 30 years in the future. Sure, right? No problem. 1985, I bought my first VCR. You guys know what a VCR is? So what did that introduce? Introduced the opportunity to watch a TV channel, a TV item, not when it was on live. There were 3 main stations, PBS, and 1 UHF channel. 5, not 635. So this was great, right? In the 30 years from 1985 to 2015, we went through VCR. Fortunately, I bought a VHS. I didn't waste my money on Betamax. Then we went to LP discs, large play discs, and that lasted maybe 3 or 4 years. Then we went to DVDs. Well, they're just pretty much gone now, right? And now, you stream it. Matter of fact, the concept of binge watching, that's like brand new in Webster's, I think. But here is a 30-year window, the same one I'm talking about for this and there is one chunk of technology that changed completely. And so where we used to have companies that made the tape that went into cassettes, whether it was for 8-tracks or, that's even another story, VCRs or cassettes. That was a whole industry that's gone now. You don't use tapes anymore. I mean, they were also part of like the computer business. So you think about what we're talking about here, and we're trying to make that guess. So my point is, technology is changing. It's changing rapidly. You do have to go through adoption cycles. You do need the capital to go into it. You need the research dollars. We're excited to be involved with UT in a lot of programs here. We do this with other universities. It's very important to us. We're all scientists at ExxonMobil. I'm a chemical engineer. We have accountants, treasurers, lawyers, and scientists. And we're all part of the same family. But engineers, by and large, are the largest number. We have extensive research organizations, and we're studying this stuff all the time. Even if we're not going to invest in electric cars, we have a group in Clinton, New Jersey, that's looking at the batteries, and one in Paarlberg that's telling us how they're going to build them, how they're going to build the cars. We're looking at high-altitude wind, nuclear, solar panels. We were in the solar business, we got out of it, but we still study it. Molten carbonate fuel cells are possible. Algae, up here. So all of this is happening. So we have to we do this outlook every year because we have to stay on top of what we think is happening because it changes so quickly. I mean, in the end, we don't want to be the Betamax guy. But more importantly, I do think it's incumbent on all of us, particularly dialogues like this today, to share our views of what we think is going to happen so we can identify what some of the challenges are. So that's the energy transition. You can go back. This goes to 1850. This is a generational thing. Energy change does not happen overnight. The scale of the system is too massive. So I did overstay my welcome a little bit, but we got some time for questions. Happy to talk about. That's Shanghai if you didn't know that.
Thank you. Well, very impressive presentation, and I see where this could go in a lot of different places and be well received. I have one question. I'm not sure that you've mentioned it. I don't think you did. What is the actual percent of energy in the gross domestic product?
On a cost basis, in the U.S., it costs our energy bill is about 4 or 5% of GDP.
It used to be 3%, but it's now 5%.
Yeah, I'm rounding. I'm playing. This is my economist mode, not my engineer mode. So it's very low. Now there are some societies. India is higher. They need more energy, and they're in the expansion mode. We have a much more efficient economy when it comes to energy. So we're able to do it on a smaller percentage. Your point is well made. It takes, for all it does for us, it's a relatively small piece. Now, in the U.S., our GDP investment cycles fell as part of the fall off in oil prices as the energy companies had to scale back investments. It was noticeable. It was particularly noticeable in states like Texas and in North Dakota and other states that were heavily invested in a lot of the expansion in the industry. But nonetheless, it is relatively small cost to society. Yes, sir.
How did you factor in negative feedback loops produced by global climate change into your prediction of 100% GDP growth?
So when we've looked at our forecast, we've looked at information coming out of the IPCC about potential costs and such, and we've looked at those scale numbers. We think that our forecast relative to third parties tends to be conservative, and we feel that represents a reasonable level given future uncertainties. So, I mean, part of it is also that a lot of the change is we're looking out to 2040. If we went out a lot further, we may have to make more adjustments. But we do lower GDP as part of our proxy cost mechanism. I don't remember the exact percentage.
I would request everyone to raise their hand if they have a question and wait for me to bring the mic.
Rob, you spoke briefly about the issue of getting in and out of solar. Would you comment a little bit about what your thinking was there?
Well, in the 80s, about getting in and out of solar, yeah. In the 80s, ExxonMobil both were involved in solar panel development, and at that stage, when you looked at the relative cost of producing a watt of electricity from solar panels, and you looked at alternative electric, and based on the technology people saw at the time, nobody really saw that there was a short circuit way to improve it dramatically. Some of it has come from manufacturing techniques, broader-based science. I don't think there's been any real breakthroughs as yet. You know, perovskites, I think I've said that correctly, which is the film matter which will improve the efficiency of panels, is still, it's a hope and a dream. It should improve things. Now we're getting into maybe built-in inverters as opposed to separate inverters with improved packaging. But really, rooftop solar continues to be, when we look at it, one of the most expensive sources of electricity. Utility-grade solar is more economical than that, but still expensive relative to wind. And so, you know, it continues to be, I mean, it requires substantial subsidies. We talked about that earlier. And so it's growing because of policy. We have policy mandates that we assume continue, and that's one of the reasons we see the growth in renewables in our outlook. I think we got one back in the back row there first.
You talked a little bit about battery production and declining manufacturing costs in the battery industry. I'm curious whether you guys have done any research into eventually what percentage of total electricity demand could be supplied by the capacity of battery storage.
Well, you got to, if you're going to supply electricity by batteries, you have to first put it in. I don't mean to be pedantic there.
No, right, sorry. To clarify, I'm curious whether you guys have done any research or any projections as to how much battery storage capacity could come onto the grid.
Well, we look at battery storage. So battery storage right now is probably one of the most expensive storage choices. The least expensive storage choice is either pumped storage or compressed air storage. There still adds substantial costs to the electricity source to do it. There are a few projects going on about that. Generally right now where battery storage is fitting in is part of the load, not load balancing day to night, but frequency balancing within a short time cycle. And that's where it's playing an important role, and particularly as you've added, as solar panels and others come in, it manages some short-term balancing criteria. Long-term, storage is like anything else. It's not a free, you don't get electricity for free. You've got to add it to the other installed capacity that you've got to build in. And when we have looked at it and others, it continues to be an expensive alternative to providing an alternative generation source, such as natural gas, that you can dispatch when you have a fall off in renewables. We know, for example, that there's no sun at night. So solar panels, if you wanted to balance that, you're going to need some dispatchable source at night. Demand does fall down. Solar panels do tend to clip the peak of afternoon demand if you're in an air conditioning environment. Not all places have afternoon demand peaks. It tends to redistribute it in different places. So it's a consideration, yes. But right now it looks like, particularly in this time horizon of our outlook, it's going to be more used in other niche applications of balancing. Doesn't mean some people aren't going to put batteries in their house. Not everybody runs an economics when they buy a car, so people will do things, and whether that if it makes sense for them, that's great. But we don't see wide-scale adoption because of the cost. I think you're up.
LNG. I was surprised in your chart on the transportation growth of gas, because it just seems like stagnant across the transportation side. Have you discounted using LNG and for rail, cars, marine, and other sources?
No,
or have you
well,
have you looked into that?
I don't remember what the chart precisely had, but
Just look at the sort of flat line between 15 and 2000.
well, right now,
2040.
if you step back and that natural gas was not LNG, it was all forms of natural gas. It's improved compressed natural gas.
Which seems, I'm just talking about natural gas, liquefied natural gas.
Okay, so it may look small. Actually, transportation gas demand, it's growing at about 6% per year. Total energy demand grows at about 1%. It actually is up 350%. It's just short because it's starting out as a small base. So it's a great, but let me come back to it for a second and let's talk about how you use it. So natural gas fits in as compressed natural gas in a number of countries, particularly I think of Iran, Pakistan, Argentina as a fuel source because they have abundant natural gas and they have the networks. In North America, you have some natural gas stations. You already have existing infrastructure. There's not a lot of choices for natural gas vehicles. Where they fit in are return to base applications, such as delivery vehicles. When you return to base, you can justify and amortize the cost of the refueling infrastructure. And so the biggest use for natural gas in that type of applications is small delivery vehicles, some utility vehicles, and your trash hauling trucks.
I'm talking about liquefied natural gas.
Okay. So I'm trying to walk through each one of those. If you let me get to the... Okay, so that's compressed natural gas use. LNG, when we looked at LNG in a heavy-duty truck application, it is probably marginally more economic than compressed natural gas. It is, at the current pricing levels, it's a more niche play in North America. Where you see LNG starting to step out more is a larger discussion in the marine space. The IMO is discussing efficiency measures going forward, and as those go up, they're looking at natural gas playing a growing role in that. The first step the IMO did was cut sulfur requirements in their liquid fuels. IMO is the International Maritime Organization. It's a global treaty organization, for those of you that aren't familiar. And all the countries that are signatories to it have agreed that starting in 2020, we're going to reduce the amount of sulfur in the liquid fuel. And so the next step is to go to efficiency improvements. LNG seems to be a third case. There are coastal areas that are already under some pressure for this, and so you can see ferries and other things talking about it. Some of the ship owners have ordered LNG fleets. They're starting to bring those in. It's just you're starting in that early adoption phase, and it's going to take a while for it to gain. Yeah, well, we do. Yeah, we went through this about 5 years ago. We started talking about gas in the transportation. Remember, we sell transportation fuels, so if there's going to be a market out there, we want to understand it. But we also look at it from what's the world going to do. My job is to not, if it's interesting from a world standpoint, I want to make sure my company people see it. My job is to tell the company what I think the world's going to do. We think transportation, gas and transportation is going to grow quickly, but it's going to be small because it's really a matter about penetration and lack of infrastructure. And LNG, compressed natural gas, LNG and rail is a consideration. It may be easier because the number of units you have to fuel are smaller or less. It just gets back, and they already use, many cases, they use turbine-based systems, and you're using diesel in those. And so you could replace LNG into those. The LA Basin is considered encouraging people to do that. China has remote gas fields and liquefies it and takes it into town so they can use natural gas in buses. This is part of their goal to clean up air quality in China cities, which we all know is a big priority for them. So gas is happening out there. It's not moving into the mainstream light-duty vehicle space. There's many other alternatives to achieve the improvements that you can get. And it also doesn't require, like in North America, duplicating your fueling infrastructure, which has a cost that somebody has to pay. It's ultimately the consumer. So yes, we look at it. We've been involved in the LNG business for a long time.
We'll take one last question and we'll wrap it up after that.
Okay.
So with that last one, maybe I'll narrow it. I was going to ask two, so maybe I'll stick with we're already on transportation, so maybe let's stick with it. I think the VHS example that you gave is informative, and I guess I would ask you to maybe comment on, further comment on electric vehicles. You discussed electric vehicles, but then when it seemed like we actually put rubber to the road, if you will, and we actually saw the chart about what the electricity demand was going to be for a variety of things, and then the transportation one was essentially non-existent in 2040. And so I was hoping you might be able to comment on that and essentially what you see for for the Teslas and the Fords of the world potentially transitioning, whether or not they take the VHS route or not.
I think all the manufacturers are focused on providing a variety of market platforms for people. Electric vehicles, some people want them. I think that I think there's a role for electric vehicles in the marketplace. China is encouraging it in their inner city areas because of air quality. China is encouraging his industrial policy because they want to create the industrial policy, the industrial base to provide the electrical vehicles in the marketplace. So I think that's that's one consideration. In the U.S., over time, we expect that and I don't remember the share of new car sales in the U.S., but it's over 10% by 2040. Now, what you have is the global fleet, and I'll use the U.S. as an example. The U.S. fleet is significant. A car stays in there 17 or 18 years. So if you're starting to add new cars at the end, even if you're selling, I don't know, 10 or 11% of them every year, you still have all the other ones you have in there. We sold, 17 million cars last year? So if you sold 10%, that would be 1.7, and you've got a fleet that's probably 250, 300 million. So you're just starting. Now, 20 years later, it's going to be a much bigger answer. Both the share will grow and the amount of penetration in the base fleet. So one of the reasons that the appearance of a small impact in the near term is really that life expectancy of the fleet. China's fleet's going to probably get to over 300, close to 400 million vehicles. And again, sales are still relatively modest. They're generally buying other things. Interestingly enough, the data currently shows that China's the fastest growing segment in the Chinese market is SUVs, primarily crossovers. And you see that. And so, again, it's going to have to come in. They'll come in as a share sale. They'll have to replace the underlying fleet. And I think, so it's difficult to see the net effect when you're looking at the sales point here and you recognize you've got to go almost 2 decades to get that turnover to happen. And that's what's going to happen. I don't know which companies are going to do well and which companies aren't. That's going to be a matter of management decision, consumer preference, and investment profiles, and frankly, shareholder concerns. So I'm not going to comment on company success or not success, but I do think it's important that we recognize that the manufacturers in many places are trying to find what the consumer wants and build the right vehicle, at the same time meeting the policy environment they're operating under, which can be fairly stringent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you for coming.